Good afternoon. I'm Dan Moulthrop. I'm the CEO of the City Club of Cleveland. Welcome to all of you here and those of you listening on WCPN and other stations. I'm pleased to be here to moderate our panel today discussing not just the death penalty in Ohio, but really why and how the debate and the discussion of the death penalty in Ohio has shifted so dramatically in recent years and where it might be headed. A 2012 Gallup poll showed that 60% of Americans support the death penalty. That may sound like a lot, and that is a lot of support for any public policy, but it's actually the lowest level of support society has seen for capital punishment in more than 40 years. Right now, there are 18 states in the United States that do not use capital punishment. Here in Ohio, where we currently have 147 inmates on death row, the debate is no longer as clear-cut as it once was. In recent years, some high-profile policymakers have dramatically shifted positions. Supreme Court Justice Paul Pfeiffer, who in 1981, as a young state legislator, actually wrote Ohio's death penalty law, he himself has become an advocate for its repeal. Former Ohio Attorney General Jim Petro, a Republican, also told Plain Dealer columnist Mark Namick, "We are probably safer, better, and smarter to not have a death penalty." And one of our panelists today is a similar kind of public figure. He's sitting right next to me. He has very visibly and vocally switched sides. That's Terry Collins, former director of the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. And in that role, he oversaw the execution of more than 33 death row inmates over his tenure. Also with us are Judge Nathaniel Jones, who retired from the U.S. Court of Appeals in 2002 after 23 years of service in a career that also included an appointment as Assistant U.S. Attorney, and Tim Young, Director of the Office of the Ohio Public Defender since 2008. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like to start out, and we're going to talk up here for the first half of the program, and then we'll work our way into the audience Q&A in the second half of the program. But Terry Collins, I'd like to start with you and ask, why is now such a different moment than we've ever seen in Ohio with respect to the death penalty?
Well, I think people are starting to question the application of the death penalty, not only in the state of Ohio, but across the country, from an economic standpoint, from a moral standpoint, to see whether or not the death penalty is actually needed. So, the Gallup poll you referred to, 60% seems high, but those numbers are somewhat encouraging because it's much less than what it was a few years ago. So I think inroads are being made and people are starting to see and ask the question, why do we really need the death penalty?
Tim Young, how do you see this particular moment in time in this particular state?
I think largely a lot of the perception issue has changed because of the problems that have occurred. There's been so many difficulties in actually performing the execution at the end process. Those became major national stories. We've also had such difficulty with the drugs and being able to obtain the drugs to perform executions. Those have become national stories. Those opened the discussion into, well, what's really going on in the death penalty? Because I think for so long the question has been, are you in favor of it or are you against it, as an end of the process. Now we're talking about the process, and that has revealed flaw after flaw in terms of geographical disparities, race disparities, numerous other disparities that now keep that conversation going. So I think there's a much deeper focus that has really started to change the nature of the conversation around the death penalty in the last 5 years or so.
I want to explore those flaws a little bit in a moment, but Judge Jones, you have the longest view on the panel. What do you see now that you haven't seen before in your career, and from your point of view from not the bench now, but from having been on the bench? I mean, what does this look like to you?
Well, I think it's becoming more apparent to segments of the public that innocent people are being killed, and there are reasons for that. I know the cases that I was involved in from the perspective of the petition for habeas corpus, which is that was a vehicle to get a lot of these cases from the state court into the federal system. some of these studies show that, and I know the Supreme Court has noticed, and it was true of our court, that upwards of 40% of the petitions for habeas corpus contain claims of constitutional error, and it was pretty well established that the constitutional error did occur.
What kind of constitutional error are we talking about?
A whole range of things, starting with the arrest, the charges, the prosecutorial exercise of prosecutorial discretion, prosecutorial misconduct, the way many trial judges, especially if you're in an elective system, these trial judges are often too willing to defer to the prosecutors. The prosecutors sort of take over these cases, and the more salacious and the more egregious the offense has been, the facts appear, the greater the likelihood is that the judges who should control what happens in the courtroom actually defer to the prosecutor. And when you have prosecutors who are ambitious, who seek to become judges or have their eye on some other political goals, they're like cowboys. And the judges who are fearful of countering these ambitious prosecutors, because they too must run for election, they defer. And then when the case goes to appeal, when you look at the record and you find that there's been a series of appeals, the fact that many of the errors that were cited were ignored or found to be harmless, to say that a error in a capital case which could result in a person being executed is harmless error is absurd. And that's what we often saw at the Court of Appeals level.
The first thing you said, Judge Jones, is that innocent people are being executed. Terry Collins, of the 33 executions that you observed and oversaw, do you have questions?
I don't believe that of the 33 that I observed that there was anybody innocent, but interesting. I had an hour drive to get from my house to Lucasville where we did the executions, and I always wondered, did we get it right? Of those 33, within 30 minutes of their execution, I spoke to them. To get into the area where the team was, I had to walk by the cell where we held the condemned inmate, and I talked to each one of them. And I'd always ask myself, I hope we got this right. I assumed that all the court, the numerous judges, the numerous appeals that had looked at it, I had to believe that it was right. I don't think we did execute anybody under my watch that was innocent, but it really changed my mind about the system, because I've seen people walk off death row. In my time in 32 years at DRC, I've seen people leave death row who were later found to be...
Raymond Towler is an important Ohio example. There have been others who've been exonerated. I want to come back to these conversations you would have with the dead men walking, as they're sort of known thanks to Sister Helen Prejean's book. Would you ask them? Did we get it right?
No, I never asked them. And surprisingly enough, most generally they were being complimentary to my staff for the way they were handled in the watch period, the 24 hours that they dealt with them. The way we allowed their families to come in and have contact visit with them, which we had never done before until I changed that procedure. So typically it was, surprisingly enough, many of them were thanking us for the way we treated them during their final hours.
But were there moments in those conversations that gave you pause? I wonder if the drive home was more reflective than the drive there.
Usually after I left, if you ask me right now to name 5 people of the 33 I couldn't tell you their names because I basically tried to wipe it out of my mind. I mean, I was asked hundreds of times after every execution, what's your position on death penalty? My position at that time was, my position in the state of Ohio, the law required I carry out the death penalty. And so that was my response. But deep down inside, I still had those haunting questions about, did we get this right? And then I heard people talk about worst of the worst, and I've worked at maximum security prison. I was a warden at Lucasville after the riot. So I've seen people who were a lot worse than those people who were on death row.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to stick with you for a second because there's some interesting things that you're saying, and then broaden the conversation back out. But what made you change your mind, and what made you decide to be a public voice in favor of the abolition of the death penalty?
Well, I think Ohio has an alternative to the death penalty, life without parole, which means you're never going to get out of prison. And if you look at the numbers since life without parole came on the books and became law in this state, and I don't exactly remember the year, Tim may remember the year, but the numbers have skyrocketed of people coming to prison doing life without parole, and the number of people coming to death row has dramatically decreased, even though we still got way too many people on death row. So it was that option, and then every time I did an execution, that question remaining, did we get this right? And knowing that we may have the greatest justice system in the world, but it can still make mistakes. And if you make a mistake and you execute someone, that's it. Whereas if it's life without parole, there's do-over. And I have walked people out of prison who were doing life sentences. I've walked them out the front door after 15, 20 years that were later to be found not guilty. So I think it was those things as a whole, and understand the economic impact of that, the social impact of the death sentence, the unfair application, seeing other people who walk in the halls of prisons who were worse than the people we were executing. All those things combined made me feel like, why are we doing this? Why do we need to do this?
One of the things, Terry Collins, that you're speaking about is the emotional cost to those who are involved. Judge Jones, from the point of view of the bench, it would seem to me that there is an emotional cost, that those who are involved either in prosecuting or serving serving as judge during these trials, that's an irrevocable decision that gets made at those moments.
Oh, absolutely. There is the last death penalty case that I participated in before I left the court was involved a man named John Bird. The case was Bird versus Collins.
I remember the case well.
That is a case where an innocent man was executed. I am as convinced as I am sitting here that the act he committed and participated in this robbery was not a death qualifying act. But it was the Ohio Supreme Court upheld the conviction by a vote of 4-3, with Justice Moyer's troubled, Justice Pfeiffer dissented. And anytime you have a decision of a person about to be killed, and there's that much of a division, 4-3, the odds are you should just let him live. And that's where the governor comes in, where the sentence can be commuted. That was a case in which there were all kinds of abuses by the county prosecutor. This was a Hamilton County case, Cincinnati, and even and one of the errors that was clearly troublesome to me was the way in which the prosecutor vouched for a snitch whose testimony was central to the conviction of John Bird. Now, John Bird was not a nice man. He had a terrible life, but that is not the basis on which we execute people. And there was a question of credibility of this snitch, and he was asked by the public defender, who was representing Mr. Byrd, whether he had any cases pending in the courts of Ohio. He said, "No, there's nothing pending, nothing involving me." When in fact he was on hold in the county jail because of an infraction that the parole board was considering, and it could have resulted in him going back to prison. And that was established. So he lied. And the jury should have been allowed to know that this man was lying when he said what he did about what John Byrd had said to him in conversation in jail. The jury never knew that. And so the jury convicted, and his conviction was affirmed. The Ohio Supreme Court upheld it 4-3. These are all things that get involved in these cases, and because the number of appellate judges who had reviewed this case over a period of some 15, 17 years totaled 70, the newspapers kept running with that. 70 judges have reviewed this case. 70 judges, as though this is an accounting problem. It's far from that. And it's the issue that should have concerned the judges was the constitutional errors that were asserted. Was there error? And they glossed over that because 70 judges had reviewed it, but the review did not go to the record. The review was just a gloss over, and they didn't get to the original record. They didn't get to the documents. They didn't review the evidence. And that evidence was not subject to review until it came to the habeas corpus process in the federal court. And that's when I became involved, and I was very troubled, and I thought that this case, thought the prosecutors were bloodthirsty. He was to have been executed on September the 12th. That's a day after 9/11. And when I urged our chief judge to issue a stay of the execution that was scheduled for 9/12, and he polled the court. And under our rule, the judges who are polled are all judges in active service. And when a majority of all the judges in active service, and when the poll showed that a majority of the active judges favored the stay, the chief judge issued a stay so that the execution wouldn't take place on September the 12th. Well, the Attorney General of Ohio and the prosecuting attorney rushed to Washington on the morning of the 11th to try to find our circuit justice, who is Justice Stevens. And before they could find Justice Stevens, the reports came in as to what happened in New York and in Washington, and the planes hitting the World Trade Center. And so all the federal buildings were vacated, including the Supreme Court. But yet the Attorney General of Ohio and the prosecuting attorney were pressing, trying to get Justice Stevens to reverse the stay granted. And in an offhand comment, the Supreme Court's, the justice could not understand the urgency when thousands of people have been killed in New York. Why is there this urgency to kill this one man on the 12th? So they would not disturb the stay, and it went forward, and the matter was remanded, and there were further hearings by a magistrate judge, and he ultimately was executed. But I think that came about because of weariness. I think the courts, the judges were just tired of the case. It had been in the pipeline for some 17 years, and they were just tired of it.
Judge Jones, the story that you tell really, in addition to highlighting constitutional issues, highlights the immense cost of death penalty in capital cases. Tim Young, your office spends an awful lot of time, energy, resources defending capital crimes. what are we spending that we wouldn't have to spend?
Well, the costs are enormous, and I mean the unfortunate reality in Ohio being a home rule state, we don't have a number, but it's tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. It's tens of millions of dollars annually on this system. That from a certainty rate, I unfortunately have to agree with the judge. Statistically, we've executed somebody who's innocent. The most stunning failure rates exist in death penalty cases. To date, in the United States, for every 10 people that we execute, we let one go as completely free, exonerated, innocent. Not they shouldn't have gotten the death penalty, but some lesser, but 1 out of 11. That's a horrifically bad number. That means we know 9% of the time a judge and jury thought there was enough to say beyond a reasonable doubt this person should die, only later to find out they were absolutely innocent. That kind of statistic says when we've hit 40 people in Ohio, we've executed 4 who were potentially innocent. And by the way, in Ohio, we do have that same rate. We have exonerated 4 people off death row to date, and we have executed just around 40. So we are right at that 1 for 10 number, 10 for 1.
So not only are we spending an awful lot of, it's as if we're spending an awful lot of money on a product that isn't reliable.
With that, you have a what is that, a 9% failure rate, and death is the outcome. You should stop.
We should talk for a moment. I want to sort of also set the stage a little bit and acknowledge we don't have a death penalty advocate on this panel, and there's a reason for that, because we're talking about how the conversation has shifted, not whether it's right or wrong. And that's why we assembled the panel that we have today. But talk a little bit about why it's so expensive. I think people who aren't lawyers and aren't involved in the criminal justice system in any fashion or haven't educated themselves about this may not understand why a capital crime and a capital case gets so expensive.
The large costs are the litigation time and expense. You want to make sure you've got this right, and despite all of the efforts, there's a huge amount of evidence that we're not getting it right. But the reality is you have a trial that is largely weeks long, and the person has 2 lawyers assigned to them. The prosecutor holds no bars in terms of what they're spending. The police department that's investigating spends hundreds of hours or thousands of hours on these cases. That's just the trial.
More when it's a death penalty case than they would if it was life without parole?
Absolutely. You've got to remember, we're talking about, and I think it cycles back, we're talking about elected officials being involved in large parts of this process. The day after a horrible murder, they are standing in front of microphones answering questions, are you going to charge this person with the death penalty? And there's that political instinct to say, yes, I'm tough on crime, made in the heat of the moment, the day after the crime occurs, or within days, without any time to really review the nature and circumstances of what really happened in this case and the background of the person who committed the crime. But you go through this process, and then you have the direct appeal of a transcript that's thousands of pages long, again by elected officials, and then you have the federal review. And that federal review is the first time you're seeing judges who are at least appointed to the process and not elected to the process. And I think that may well have some impact on why we see such high correlation rates between reversal rates in federal court versus state court. The federal courts aren't any more liberal than the state courts. They simply are allowed more freedom to make decisions that are unpopular. And saying that somebody who committed a heinous crime shouldn't get the death penalty is largely not a popular decision when you're still polling at 60%.
Inside the prison, Terry Collins, how much more expensive is it to operate a death row than to operate a unit of prisoners who are there on life without parole?
Well, much more expensive, because death row is a specific population that in this state is kept isolated from the rest of the population. So you have a specific area of the prison. The staffing component of that area is much higher than your normal prison population. So you've increased your costs just for staffing. You still have your marginal costs, your clothing, your food, those type of things, but the majority of costs in operation of prisons is how many people you have watching the people, and that number is exorbitant. Plus, we had to set up special rooms for attorneys because we got attorney visits coming in and out, and you're talking appeals go on for 15, 20, 25 years. I mean, it's not like it happens today and it's over tomorrow. Look at the Attorney General's office, a complete section for capital crimes. That's all those attorneys do, is deal with cases in the court. So from a prison standpoint, because you had to isolate these individuals into a specific area of the prison and staff that, typically your staffing pattern was about double there versus what it would be in a normal area. And the people with life without parole, the majority of them are not in maximum security prisons in Ohio. They're in what we call close security, which is a level below. They're still very secure prisons, but they typically do very well in the prison population, and
they take a long view.
They know that that's where they're going to be for the rest of their life. They make it their home.
Litigation expenses go down significantly. As soon as you have life without parole, there's one appeal, maybe. In many of the cases, there are no appeals if it was a plea agreement, and there's nothing to relitigate. So you've reduced litigation costs, and finality for the victim's family and finality for the system stops with life without parole.
But I think I think Tim makes a very important point. Finality for victims. I mean, I talk to the victims' families right before I would go over to the execution chamber. In talking with people that they're reliving, have relived this moment from 20 years ago, have relived it 15, 20 times through the appeal process, and now we're down to the final day, and I'm explaining to them, you know, everything might not go just exactly right here. You know, if it doesn't happen as quick as you think it was going to happen, you know, there are processes, procedures we have to go through with the team and all those things.
There could be a last-minute stay.
And there could be a last-minute stay. I mean, typically we didn't start the process until we had word from the United States Supreme Court and from the governor's office that everything was a go. But there was problems with getting the needle, getting the IV started. There were those problems. But to see these people after 17, 18, 19 years and to think about what they've been through, whereas the life without parole case, I'm not going to say it's ever over. I don't know if there's ever closure for a victim. I've never had anybody murdered in my family. So I don't know if there's ever closure, but you can't tell me it's healthy that every couple of years it's opened up again and we got to think about this whole thing over again.
Yeah. Terry Collins, thank you for that. Judge Jones, you were leaning in.
I'd like to make 2 points. When there was a moratorium declared on capital punishment cases by the Supreme Court, and that moratorium extended for a number of years. And then when it was about to reintroduce the death penalty, the Judicial Conference of the United States, which is a supervisory body of all federal courts, was very concerned because even though there had been the moratorium, states were continuing to prosecute and convict persons for capital offenses. Ohio had almost 100 persons on death row by the time death penalty was reestablished, and other states had the same thing. What my court did, our chief judge, at the suggestion of the Supreme Court, established task forces. Task forces, these are capital punishment task forces that would be presided over by a judge on the court, would be made up of a number of members of the profession. The task forces would provide training for lawyers, because many lawyers who were taking these cases were not equipped, were not trained, were not prepared to handle capital cases. Capital cases are much different than the ordinary criminal case. And when you get to the habeas stage, it's much different. And so these capital task forces were supposed to train civil lawyers, get the whole bar community involved so that they would know how to conduct the habeas corpus proceeding. We organized, I was chairman of the Sixth Circuit task force, and we were organized in the 3 states that have the death penalty. Michigan does not have one, but Ohio, Tennessee, and Kentucky have the death penalty. We were all staffed up, ready to go, when Congress defunded these task forces. We couldn't spend any money to carry out these programs, so we were back to home base with the death penalty, and consequently these executions started going off 1, 2, 3 all over the country. One other point I made, I represented the last living Scottsboro boy. I don't know whether, I don't know whether you remember the Scottsboro cases, But the last living, he died just a couple of years ago, was living in New York. He was a fugitive. And he wanted to go back to Alabama. He was tired of being a fugitive. He had married and had a family. And so George Wallace was the governor at that time, and we didn't know what fate would befall him if he went back to Alabama under George Wallace. And we tried to get Nelson Rockefeller, who was governor of New York at that time, to allow him to stay in New York under supervision of the New York authorities. But there's a statute that doesn't permit that to happen. So we got busy, and we represented Clarence Norris was his name. And we negotiated with the Attorney General of Alabama and the Governor of Alabama and reached an agreement whereas we would take him back to Alabama, and the Pardon and Parole Board would recommend to Governor Wallace that he be given a pardon. And we flew down to Montgomery and with Clarence Norris and his wife, and we met with the authorities there, including George Wallace, and he was given a pardon, and we flew back to New York. He was a free man. But that's a case that started in 1931. And he was on death row 4 different times. And just 2 weeks ago, the Alabama legislature pardoned all of the Scottsboro boys. There were 8 of them, pardoned all of them, because it was established that they were all innocent. Even though they had been on death row at various times, and Clarence had been on death row 4 different times within hours of being taken to the execution chamber. So that's why I've taken such a strong position against the death penalty.
Judge Nathaniel Jones, thank you very much for that. So we've talked about the moral argument, the economic argument, and the exoneration issue. We haven't really explained the drug problem, the execution drug problem, but perhaps that will come up in the Q&A along with maybe the research that suggests the death penalty actually does have a deterrent effect. There's some dispute on that, but it'd be interesting to talk about that. We're going to pause for a little bit of housekeeping here. I am, as I said at the beginning, Dan Moulthrop. We're at the City Club of Cleveland in a Friday Forum panel discussion on the death penalty in Ohio, talking with, as I said, Judge Nathaniel Jones, who retired from the U.S. Court of Appeals. Also with us is Terry Collins, retired director of Ohio's Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, and Tim Young, the director of the Ohio Office of Public Defender, or the Office of the Ohio Public Defender, depending on how you'd like to say that. Our question and answer session is ahead. We encourage you to formulate all of your questions now, and we do just simply remind you and gently remind you that your questions should be brief and to the point. But all are welcome to ask questions. If you're watching on the web, feel free to submit questions via Twitter. We are at the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those joining us via our primary media partner, IdeaStream, where you hear us on 90.3 WCPN and 104.9 WCLV, and watch us on WVIZ, PBS, and the Ohio channel. You can also hear us on WTAM or one of our many broadcast partners across the country. Broadcasts of the City Club of Cleveland are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC, and our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. The City Club will not be hosting a forum next Friday, and we wish all of you joy in celebrating a happy holiday season. We will return on January 10th with Steve Phillips, co-founder and board chair of PowerPack.org. For information and reservations about all of our upcoming programs, please visit us online at cityclub.org. You can also find our archives there and order a CD or DVD of one of our many past programs. We welcome guests today at tables hosted by Baker Hostetler and Ohioans to Stop Executions. Thank you very much for your support. Today's forum, along with all of our conversations on politics and policy, is sponsored by the Northeast Ohio Media Group, providing content, sales, and marketing for The Plain Dealer, Cleveland.com, and Sun News, serving collectively 1.3 million readers in print and online. We welcome students to today's program. Student participation is made possible by a generous gift from the Jeffrey David Epstein Memorial Fund. We welcome students from Gilmore Academy, Cleveland Heights High School, and the Cleveland School of the Arts. Will students please stand to be recognized? Now let's jump into our traditional City Club question and answer period. As I said before, we do welcome questions from all, including guests, and holding the microphone today is our program director, Carrie Miller.
Thank you, Dan. Great panel. I have a right to life and a right to death question. The right to life question, are any of your panel members aware of any significant involvement by right to life communities or organizations in the effort to stop the death penalty? The right to death penalty, or the right to die question, which might be directed to Mr. Collins. Presuming we continue to have a death penalty, do you think that a person voluntarily and presuming competence should have the right to take his own life in a perhaps more private and less public spectacle manner?
Interesting questions. Who wants to take the right to life question? I'm pretty sure I know the answer. Very clever, Tom.
Very good question. I don't know of any right to life groups or individuals who have said anything about the death penalty. Your second question is a very difficult. I mean, suicide in prison, you may know here recently, Billy Schlegel was on death row, and a couple hours before he would have went on suicide. There was some discussion that maybe his attorneys had information that would have gotten a stay. So it was a huge issue, and suicide in prison is always an issue. You probably remember back to Wilfred Berry, the volunteer, who was in the 97 or 98, was a huge question about whether or not he should be allowed to do that. I would question someone's mental faculty. I mean, I enjoy life, so to say I want to take my own life, there has to be some serious issues with mental illness and health, in my opinion. And I'm not a mental health clinician, but our prisons are full of mental health people, so I've dealt with a lot of those people. So I'd have to question someone who wanted to take their own life. But being in prison is a very lonely, rigid, controlled environment that some people can't learn to cope with that and will act out. Death row, you might be surprised to know that death row was a place that when I was a warden I would go to because it was always very clean, very quiet, and most of the people on death row were typing on their typewriters and saying yes sir, no sir. So it was a very solemn, quiet place, unlike some of the other cell blocks that I dealt with. So death row was completely different. And most people were working on their appeals and looking forward to hopefully getting a favorable decision out of the court, but oftentimes that did not occur.
Judge Jones, Tim Young, either of you have any thoughts or know of any right to life groups that are advocating an abolition of the death penalty?
No, not that are specifically right to life. You have primarily religious organizations who are working on abolition issues. I don't think I define them strictly as right to life. It may be one of the planks of their belief system, but it's not that they are a pro-life group organized as they organized for abortion issues.
This issue of a right to die also brings to mind the wishes of one death row inmate to donate his organs. Tim Young, can you explain that a little bit, the issues involved there?
Well, I mean, actually our client, Mr. Phillips, offered to donate his organs. His mother needs a kidney. And we're talking, just as a caveat, we're talking about living donation, organs that you can remove, which the patient will survive. There were reports that his sister needed a heart. Nobody was talking about taking his heart out in the middle of a surgical suite. But we are talking about like lobe of a liver or kidney donation. The issues that arise there are that have been raised. You've got security issues. You've got the cost issues of the surgery. You've got the moral stigma of receiving, as I've heard it described, of receiving a organ from somebody who's committed a heinous crime. Although anecdotally, it seems that there are plenty of people on those wait lists who would be more than happy to accept a kidney after years and years of dialysis. So the questions that have come up are, if we're going to go down this road, and I think Governor Kasich is looking at it seriously, is are we talking about family donation only, or are we actually talking about donation outside of that? I think the security issue and cost issue, the Department of Corrections runs a medical wing full-time in OSU Hospital. So we have surgical suites where there's security already in place. All that's taken care of. Most of this would be covered either by the donation services or by Medicare, Medicaid. So I think largely it's more a public policy choice about whether we're going to go down this road. And obviously I would support this move. Let them do something beneficial. If that's the desire at that point.
I think we did have one time, and I can't tell you the name, but he donated his body to Wright State University, as I recall, after the execution.
Let's get another question.
You alluded to the variance in what happens whether a case is prosecuted as a death penalty case or not. That decision, at least in Ohio, is up to the county prosecutor, a single individual. Are you aware of anywhere else in the country, or would you be in favor of the establishment of at least a semi-independent panel or a review board that would bring some uniformity to the criteria under which the death penalty is sought?
That, I believe, was part of the original legislation and is one of the reasons Justice Pfeiffer has switched sides. But Tim Young, go ahead. And Judge Jones, I'd like to
There
hear
was
from you on
recently a task force that has largely completed its work, although the report is not done. I was a member of that task force. One of the recommendations was, although it was a very contested vote, was to create a charging panel at the Attorney General's office that would be made up of Attorney General employees as well as retired prosecutors who would bring consistency to charging decisions, that prosecutors would seek the death penalty but need approval from this panel to bring consistency, because we have just horrific disparities in the death penalty in terms of charging decisions. The question said, you know, it is the decision of one person, and I think that is exemplified nowhere more than Cuyahoga County, where you had a prior prosecutor who indicted quite a few cases. When I say quite a few, let me let you know that Cuyahoga County indicted in 1 year 60% of all death penalty cases in the entire state of Ohio. When the former prosecutor retired, the indictment rate in Ohio literally was cut in half. Compared to your present prosecutor, who, as far as I know, has brought one death penalty indictment since he took office. So when I hear the argument that the charging decision represents the will of the people, I represent the will of the people, my answer is no, it represents the will of the single individual in charge of that office at that time. And you end up with horrible disparities geographically, with Cuyahoga and Hamilton County bringing in the lion's share of people on death row. You end up with horrible racial disparity, where we have a horrible value of life problem, that we seem to value white life far more than black life. So if you're going to bring any consistency to this, you've got to take it out of the hands of 88 well-intentioned people, but 88 people who are going to have 88 different views of what is and isn't a death penalty case.
Judge Jones.
Well, I agree with that, and I would just contrast that to the federal system. The Justice Department will not, or the federal government will not sanction or authorize a charge that would contain the death penalty without the approval of the Attorney General. So no matter what a U.S. attorney in some jurisdiction may wish, that U.S. attorney must submit the case to the Justice Department, and it works its way up through the criminal division, up to the really up to the Attorney General himself or herself. And I think there has to be that type of deliberation when you're dealing with something as horrendous as a death penalty, and to bring some uniformity to it. As a result, you find, seldom do you find persons being convicted on a death penalty classification. It has to have the specific approval of the Attorney General.
Next question.
This question is addressed to each of the members of the panel. To what extent do you think that the retention of the death penalty in most of the states of the United States, particularly the southern states, represents really a deep-rooted racial prejudice.
Well, I think Tim mentioned earlier, we value white life more than we value black life, and if you look at the statistics of the number of people on death row, most people would say to me, well, it's about 50-50. Well, but look at the population of the state of Ohio in reference to racial breakdown. So I think certainly there's some deep-rooted issues there. The problem with the death penalty is so many people have their own personal opinion, and so many people are really uneducated about the death penalty and the criminal justice system as a whole, in not seeing those people and that it's still human life. I mean, people used to say to me, why do you treat people so humanely when you're about ready to execute them? And I'm saying I'm still dealing with a human being, that we're trying to do this in a professional, dignified way as possible. So I think there's probably some deep-rooted things there.
Tim Young.
The death penalty is clearly racist. Is that its purpose? No. I think vengeance is its purpose. I don't think justice is its purpose. I think vengeance is honestly the purpose of the death penalty. And in fact, we've created this term called retributive justice, because we've said forever, policy-wise, revenge is not, does not have a place in our justice system. That is not what society views as justice, as revenge. We don't do that. Justice is about public safety. Justice is about rehabilitation. Justice is about fair punishment for a crime. It's not about revenge. But we created this term called retributive justice. And what does retributive mean other than vengeance? But I don't think the purpose is racism, although the outcome is clearly, obviously racist, and fundamentally one of the most important reasons that we stopped doing this. Because for years, and it's not just Ohio, Ohio's had 3 separate studies that says the death penalty has racial overtones that are significant. And they match studies done in every single state in this country. There's not a death penalty system in the United States that doesn't have a race problem. And in the words of famous justices, we should stop tinkering with the machinery of death. We cannot seem to get that out of our system. And if you can't, you should stop.
Judge Jones?
I agree, absolutely. I was always impressed by the fact that there were 2 Supreme Court justices who, as a matter of principle, always opposed capital punishment. That was Justice William Brennan and Justice Thurgood Marshall. They just automatically just voted against death penalty. When I was involved with the Byrd case in Cincinnati, I was focusing on and that was a case that puzzled some people because John Byrd was white. And they were wondering, well, why are you, a black guy, going to the mat for this white? As one person said, this white dude. And I said, because we have the Constitution. And he didn't get a fair trial. And his rights were violated, and you put the race aside, the system did not work. And if it's not working for this white dude, it's not going to work for a brother. So that's the reality.
Somebody tweet that, please.
I had the same thought. I got to write that down. I sat next to Judge
If
Nathaniel.
it's not working for this white dude, it's not going to work for the brother. If you have questions on this side of the room, just please raise your hand. We've got only a single mic holder today.
Does the governor have the power to commute any death sentence, and what are the factors that he has to consider in doing so?
Tim Young, I think that's, or Terry Collins. Procedural.
Very briefly, the governor, there's an argument. No, the answer today, reading strictly the statutes, the governor cannot commute a sentence unless and until the parole board makes a recommendation. Now, they don't have to make a positive recommendation, but they have to have heard a clemency case before he can say, I commute this case. So there's a precursor step. It doesn't matter what they recommend. They could unanimously recommend no clemency, and he can still grant it.
A commutation would be a change the death sentence to life without parole.
Yes, normally that's it. Occasionally life with a possibility of parole, but that's rare.
Our next question, please.
Hello, I have a question for Mr. Tim Young. It says here that you started the Ohio Wrongful Conviction Project. I was wondering what methods you use to prove these convicts innocent, be it not DNA testing?
Well, we started the Wrongful Conviction Project because Ohio already has a very outstanding innocence project, but it's DNA-based, and it's run out of the University of Cincinnati. But it struck us that if you have all of these problems in DNA cases where we know a person was misidentified or we know there was junk science like hair examples or bite mark evidence, well, those exist in cases where there was non-DNA. So we started the project looking for those same issues that led to DNA exonerations that we don't have DNA in. So we focus on junk science issues. We focus on cases that are on bad arson evidence. The arson science has changed significantly in 20 years. What we used to call arson largely look like accidental fires today. Bite mark evidence, complete junk. Somebody says they can match a bite mark, just walk away. Hair follicles, unless you've got DNA on the tip, the best you can say is it's similar. But we see all the time in cases where, oh, it matches. Well, you know what matches mean? It's brown. They have brown hair, he has brown hair. That's what they're calling a match. Without DNA, mitochondrial DNA. But DNA is about the only science that I would presently tell you that there's really good testing on, that you can get really identifiable characteristics, but there are all kinds of things that we know have led to bad convictions. Those are the things we look for.
You know, in that vein, are you also, over the last couple of weeks, there's been some coverage, and listeners of NPR will have heard an interview on Fresh Air, or if you read The New Yorker, there was a piece about coerced confessions. Is that something that you're finding here in Ohio as well? Absolutely.
Those are the types of cases that we look for. There's this common belief. You wouldn't confess to it if you didn't do it, and it is amazing. Amazing how often, just with a couple of hours of interrogation and the right questioning techniques, that somebody will say, if I can leave, I will tell you anything. What do you want to know? Without physical abuse, but just with gentle, coercive questioning techniques.
Well, but even in a broader sense in the criminal justice system, confessions versus plea bargaining, I mean, the majority of people come to prison now come as a result of plea bargaining. Roughly 95 to 98% of the people come to prison because of plea bargaining. I mean, I've talked to guys.
Meaning they never go to trial.
Right.
There's never been evidence presented.
Right. Well, I've talked to guys who said, well, they had me charged with 35 crimes, and they kept telling me that if I go to trial, I'm going to be facing 60, 70 years, and they offered me a 2-year sentence. I mean, I'm plumb, and just not plumb dumb. That I'm going to, I'll do the 2 years. I'm not going to take my chance. You see that every day.
And yet, in many cases, it's still a life sentence in terms of the decision of pleading to that changes everything that comes afterwards.
It's a life sentence if you plead to a probation violation or probation, because then you're stigmatized for the rest of your life. Jobs, housing, I can list a multitude of things that a conviction on your record will cause you problems for the rest of your life.
Let's have another question, please.
My question is both for Mr. Young and Mr. Collins. Mr. Young, you pointed out that our system is not retributive, but it's looking for a fair punishment for a crime. And so I'm wondering what the difference is between those two things. And the second thing is, one of the arguments against getting rid of the death penalty that I've heard is that life in prison isn't so bad, and some people have it a lot worse than someone who's in prison. Because they can get an education and they can watch TV and there's all kinds of other things. So I'm wondering if, Mr. Collins, you could give us some idea of what a day in the life of a person who's in prison without parole is like. Thank you.
Tim Young first.
As to the first question, in terms of punishment for a crime, generally you're looking at a number of factors in terms of a policy or a philosophy of what that means. And you're looking at what will compensate the public, not an individual, but the public for whatever crime. And if you're talking about physical violence against another person, what we've decided on as a policy is to take people's liberty. How long is that liberty then is somewhat correlative to the degree of violence that was brought upon somebody else. I think there are a number of other factors, obviously, that go into that in terms of people's prior records, in terms of their amount of remorse. There's a whole laundry list or a matrix, if you will. But revenge is not one of them. As a policy, vengeance is not part of a justice system. Vengeance is an emotion. and an emotion that I completely understand why you would want somebody, you want that person hurt, killed. They took something from you so precious, a family member. But that's exactly who shouldn't be deciding what happens in terms of the outcome of a case in a justice system.
Terry Collins.
I've heard people say that, but in 32 plus years, I never had anybody come knocking on the door saying, let me in. And I never had anybody refuse to leave when we told them they could go. And I had a few people who tried to leave when they shouldn't have tried to leave. Imagine your life for however long it's going to be that you can't leave this room. That you're told when to get up, when to go to bed, what kind of clothes you're going to wear, what you're going to eat today, what you can purchase in the commissary. You're subject yourself to being strip searched multiple times in a day if the officer so chooses to do so. If you go on a visit with your loved one, your mother, your father, your wife, your brother, your sister, your aunt, your uncle comes to visit you, you're going to get strip searched before you go into visit, and you're going to get strip searched when you come back out because they're going to make sure you're not carrying any contraband. We're going to tell you who you can talk to on the telephone. We're going to tell you what property you can control, and you better be able to fit it in a locker box that is what we call 2.4. It's about 3 grocery bags. That's what your life's going to be. Yes, you can get an education. Yes, you can watch TV. A TV to me was a babysitter. I'd rather have guys sitting watching TV than out running around dealing in drugs or whatever. And oh yes, there are drugs in prison. Addiction doesn't stop at the front door. So if you want somebody to control everything about your life, then prison's a place for you to be. But it's not a place that I'd want to be, and I worked there for 30-some years. And that's why we see so many people who have mental health issues in prisons and suicides are committed. It's not, I'm not going to say there's not people who don't, lifers, particularly murder cases and guys who are doing life without parole, were some of the best inmates they ever had because it became their home. They wanted to keep things calm, but they had to learn after a number of years how to do that. So it's not a place that people want to come to.
Terry Collins, thank you very much for that. We've got to wrap up, and we haven't covered every issue that we set out to cover. And something tells me that with the recent legislation that's either been introduced or going to be introduced by some local representatives, including Nikki Antonio of Lakewood, that this may come up for debate, and we will have a chance to be hearing from both sides, and certainly there are more than 2 sides actually to this. But I want to thank all of you. Terry Collins, former director of the Ohio Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Tim Young from the Office of the Ohio Public Defender. He is the state of Ohio's public defender. And Judge Nathaniel Jones, thank you very much for your time today. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to a City Club Friday Forum on the death penalty in Ohio. I'm Dan Moulthrop, and our forum's now adjourned.